before fast food existed or Gordon Ramsay's rise to culinary stardom. Another variation of delicacies thrived in ancient Egypt, such as bread, underage drinking, and roasted hedgehogs, among others. Fortunately for Sonic, Sega didn't introduce their speedy hedgehog until 1960, sparing him from the ancient cookpots. Though it wasn't a common food source, its preparations proved to be quite creative. Firstly, the Egyptians would cover the hedgehog's body with clay and bake it over fire. This clever method helped remove the sharp quills by cracking the clay open after baking it over fire. Beyond just eating them, the hedgehogs had symbolic significance to Egyptian culture. Their hibernation pattern represented rejuvenation and rebirth associated with the annual flooding of the Nile. Food was very important to the Egyptians. It is ingrained into their culture, and it was found that amulets and figurines were made in favor of the hedgehogs. Now, it doesn't seem so bad to be a hedgehog after all, so far as you get royalties on figurine sales. Hedgehogs, however, were not the only source of meat. Roasted oxen, camels, ducks, and other wild game were also available. Hunting required using various methods, including nets and skillful throwing of rocks. To prepare these meals, they utilized clay pots over open fires for boiling, which allowed them to cook the meat until they were tender. Roasting, on the other hand, involved cooking on skewers or in clay ovens over an open flame, as depicted in tomb paintings showing scenes of meat on spits or hanging above fires. For grilling, they used metal and clay grills placed over fires, thus cooking food quickly at high heat, which added distinct flavors and textures to their dishes. For the commoners, sheep and goat meat were the lesser options, but they still relished it, to the point of giving it as offerings to the gods or the deceased, as part of the general culture. Ancient Egyptians believed that by providing food provisions for the deceased, they could ensure they would have access to these sustenance offerings in the afterlife. With a piece of bread in your hand, you'll find paradise under a pine tree. A Russian proverb that stays true to the power of bread. While there was no pine tree in the desert, beer was apparent, under which children drank as their substitute for nowadays apple juice. We'll come to that in a moment. Brewing is essential in the creation of beer, and its process involves mixing cooked loaves of bread with water, allowing the mixture to ferment in heated jars. This produced a dark, thick red beer. And like any skill, over time they advanced their brewing skills to using barley and emmer wheat, alongside added flavorings like honey and herbs. But this was for the premium beer often kept for the elites. The final part of every brewing is, of course, the drinking. Beer was often consumed through perforated clay straws to filter out solid particles from the thick porridge-like beer. Most Egyptians even drank beer instead of water directly from the Nile, as they observed people getting sick from the water. You're probably still stuck on children drinking beer, but before you call child support, the alcohol content of ancient Egyptian beer was likely lower than modern beers, making it safer for children to drink in moderation. Tell us what you think in the comment below, how much beer you'd have consumed as a child in ancient Egypt. Bread, on the other hand, was a staple food in ancient Egypt, primarily made of emmer wheat, which proved tricky to process than other wheat varieties. It had to be dehusked by moisturizing and pounding to remove the chaff with a pestle without crushing the grains. It was then dried, winnowed, sieved, and finally milled into flour using a type of grinding stone called quern. You may have heard of bread as the second word for money in current times. Here's where it made sense. The Egyptian laborers were sometimes paid with bread, which was widely accepted as a form of currency. More bread equals more purchasing power. The ancient Egyptians had a variety of fruits thanks to the fertile lands along the River Nile. This gave them access to fruits such as dates, which were mostly used as sweeteners for wine, cakes, and other meals. Pomegranates also grew in abundance, which were prized for their juices and seeds. The Nile did not only provide adequate conditions for just fruits to grow, vegetables like onions, garlic, sprouted, which were cultivated and used for cooking, and were accessible to even the poorest of Egyptians. The only difference is they didn't have the richer level of ingredients we now have access to, as they imported a good amount of spices such as cinnamon, mustard, thyme, in order to create flavorful exotic cuisines, which were very expensive and were likely reserved for the elites. Nevertheless, the commoners and elites both enjoyed their own locally sourced cumin and coriander used to season various meals, including meat, baked bread, and stew, just to name a few. With all these bountiful amount of food items, the River Nile paved the way for their agriculture, with cyclic events like its annual flooding, which brought about nutrient-rich silt that contributed to making the land graciously fertile, hence serving as the spawn point for vegetables, fruits, and wildlife. No, not for Call of Duty. The flooding even prompted the Egyptians into developing early calendars and astronomical observations to better predict and prepare for the flood. The Nile also provided a means of transportation that served as a passageway, allowing people and goods to be delivered between settlements along its banks. Now, how did they store the foods without a freezer? Drying was a common method to preservation. The hot and arid climate of Egypt provided ideal conditions for drying various foods. Grains, fruits, and meat were the main candidates for this method. Salting also aided in prolonging the shell life. Fish and meat can be prolonged longer by helping draw out the moisture and inhibit the growth of bacteria. It's like they mistakenly invented beef jerky. Other methods like pickling and fermentation provided the same results in increasing storage life of various foods. We've talked about preserving food, so what about storing? The ancient Egyptians used granaries and silos, which were large storage containers used to store grains that were well ventilated, that protected them from moisture and pests. They also utilized underground storage, to which foods were also stored in underground spaces to slow down the spoilage process. Its environment provided a naturally cooler temperature compared to the hot surface temperatures, helping to slow down the spoilage process caused by heat. In the modern day, we would call this food hack. It went beyond just storing techniques. It also provided economic stability so that surplus harvest could be stored and used during lean times, supporting balance in trade. Snickers never existed, but the Egyptian elites consumed nuts. This came during the Greco-Roman period, but their presence in early diets is somewhat uncertain. Pistachios and pine nuts have also been identified in some archaeological sites from ancient Egypt, suggesting they were known and consumed to some degree. What they were known to have was honey, which was a luxury to have, gotten largely from local beekeeping and imports from other areas, such as the Mediterranean or the Sahara. Don't think the luxury ended there. You needed to be Elon Pharaoh to get access to milk and meat from exotic animals like cows, goats, and even camels. To top off the luxurious meals, the perfect presentation was crucial. The breads were made into fanciful shapes like obelisks, animals, and geometric designs to imitate more costly offerings. The meat is carefully butchered and depicted as hanging up on lines or racks. The fish were cleaned, gutted, and split open down the backbone to dry in the sun. Of course, these were served on golden plates to indicate high wealth and power of the pharaohs. Seating arrangement was by class and status, and when it came to cultural activities such as festivals, these were important aspects of tradition for the ancient Egyptians. Starting from nobility, the pharaohs sat on thrones and high chairs. These were elaborately decorated, made of wood, and sometimes gilded with gold. The priests and officials sat on benches and stools, which had tiny differences from the commoners, who had mats and simple stools. If you feel the unfairness of the treatment, understand that such discrepancies in status still exist today. Instead of being measured by nobility, it is now measured by wealth. Wealth brings along with it power, freedom, and hate. Check the comments section. By now, someone would have expressed their own view. And while scrolling, try hitting the subscribe button, even if it's by accident. It will help the channel go a long way. Meals were at the very head of community gathering and bonding. Communal activities and religious festivals were the central place, where sharing food was a common practice.